Justice Molinari, let's turn back the pages of history. The date is December the 7th, 1941. Let's start from there.
Well, of course, today is the anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day, as they called it, and it brings back memories of a very eventful day, and of course it was a tragic day as well. But insofar as people of Italian descent are concerned, it was equally memorable because Italy was at war with the United States, and there was quite a lot of activity in the Italian community on the afternoon of December the 7th, 1941, as well as that evening. As several people rather a fair number of people in the Italian community were apprehended by the FBI and the military authorities, I suppose under an abundance of caution, because the bombing of Pearl Harbor had taken everyone by surprise. But apparently the FBI and the military authorities had some investigation prior to that time on people in the Italian community, particularly Italian aliens who had expressed openly sympathy for Mussolini and his government and had made pronouncements to that effect. In any event, a number of these people were apprehended and put into custody. And I, as a practicing attorney at that time, received several calls from mothers and wives asking if I could do something or to locate their beloved ones. And it took us several days to find out where these people had been put, and it turned out that they were brought out to the Salvation Army Home on Silver Avenue, which was used as a place of detention. A number of these people were absolutely, in my judgment, innocent people whose only connection with the movement of the day was that they were members of the so-called Italian Legion. It happened that after World War I, a number of the Americans, of course, formed the American Legion, and the Italian immigrant who came here, who had served in World War I, and we must be mindful that in that war, Italy was an ally of the United States. They sort of felt that as veterans, since they couldn't join the American Legion, they would form their own Italian Legion. And a number of these people, who were merely members of the so-called Italian Legion, were among those who were apprehended on this evening. I don't know the basis for it. I suspect that perhaps at some of the meetings someone might have said something in approbation of Mussolini's activities, but in any event, that's what happened. Most of these people were, of course, released within a day or two after an initial screening process, which was participated in by a military tribunal right out at the Salvation Army Home. So it was, in effect, a screening process, and I think the government was acting out of an abundance of caution. Of course, there were a number of Italians who were avowedly in favor of Italy and had made this position known. These people were actually put in concentration camps. There was a concentration camp for Italian aliens in Missoula, Montana, and that's where these people were detained throughout the war.
As we know, the Japanese evacuation order was a military order issued by General DeWitt. Did General DeWitt actually propose that Italians be evacuated on a large scale, Mr. DeMartini?
Well, I don't know, but I know that DeWitt took very strong action, and the hysteria that gripped the community. I remember when Mussolini and Hitler, and the Pearl Harbor was bombed right after. They looked to all foreigners whose nationalities were involved in the war. And the interesting thing is, I remember up in Sacramento, Governor Olson, with whom we had met prior to that, and he signed a proclamation declaring Columbus Day our particular celebration in San Francisco. And there was a movement in the legislature to evacuate all, it didn't get anywhere, all Italians of the second generation. And first generation, I mean. And the interesting thing is that died, but there were tremendous, most of these people, I remember one of the priests of Salesian Church, Father Galli, who was a strong advocate of Mussolini, but a real American. These people, all Americans, they were interested in the country of their ancestors, just as they are now. And one famous name I think we might mention was Sylvester Andriano. Sylvester Andriano was removed from the Western Command, and he went to Reno. Another gentleman who was removed went to Chicago and got a job with the Internal Revenue. He was removed as a possible dangerous citizen here, and there he was working for the government back in Chicago, which is ironical, to say the least. However, it was hysteria, and maybe the military was extremely cautious, but so far as I remember, Don, there wasn't one case of sabotage or anything contrary to the government among the Italians, all during the war.
Judge, what made it particularly ironic for Mr. Andriano to be evacuated?
Well, Mr. Andriano happened to be chairman of a draft board at the time he was evacuated. The government thought enough of him to appoint him chairman of the draft board, which of course took some considerable screening for anyone to get that type of position. Mr. Andriano, of course, was one of our leading San Franciscans. He had been a member of the Board of Supervisors, and he had been the police commissioner under Angelo Rossi's term of office.
And did not he come back to San Francisco and, in
Yes.
effect...
Well, hindsight determined, as it did in the case of the Japanese, that General DeWitt really didn't have the power that he exercised, but the Japanese, of course, acceded to his desires. You must understand that General DeWitt never did declare martial law in California or in this area, in which case he would have had the authority that he did exercise. So this was still a civilian community governed by its civilian laws, but he did order these people out. These were citizens, men that Mr. DeMartini refers to were actually American citizens, so they couldn't be put in camps, but General DeWitt just said, get out of California, and they did. They didn't want to make an issue of it.
Andriano's main connection, I think, the real underlying reason why they went after him was the fact that he was also attorney for the Italian consul, as the justice will remember.
Yes, and of course that brought him very close to anything that had to do with the consulate and the consular affairs, because he was the attorney for the Italian consul. But to get back to Mr. Andriano, he did leave the state, went to Torino, where he lived for a while. But then, as in the latter part of the war years, he just decided that he would return, and he let the general know that he was coming back, made it known, and nothing ever happened. He came back, and no one ever did anything about it.
Gentlemen, during that period, there were curfews, particularly for the aliens. And considering that Italian Americans, or Italians specifically, worked in jobs like scavengers, fishermen, where the hours were early in the morning, how was that worked out, or what was the program of that, and what really happened to...
Well, there was a curfew that all Italian aliens, German aliens, and of course at the beginning Japanese aliens as well, had to be in their homes at 8 o'clock at night and couldn't leave until the next morning at 8 o'clock. And of course, people who were in in work like the garbage collection, where they got up at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning to do their work. The fishermen as well, janitorial personnel.
Produce market, yeah. Produce market.
Produce market people. So a system was set up that was administered by the U.S. Attorney's Office, whereby upon a representation that the person was reliable, a special permit was issued to the individual to leave at a given hour for his place of employment. Interestingly enough, this program was under the direction of Judge Alfonso Zerpoli, who was then a member of the U.S. Attorney's Office, now, of course, a federal district judge. And so they were rather liberal with these permits, and as long as you represented that you need to leave before 8 o'clock in the morning for your employment, you got the permit.
What steps were taken to literally bring a halt to any desires maybe the government might have had via this general or somebody else to put these Italian aliens in a concentration camp? Now, we know that the Japanese were placed there, but some kind of effort had to be made working through the government or higher-ups. Was there a committee or a group, or how was this
Yes,
done?
of course, after the Japanese were evacuated, rumors were rampant that the general had the same idea with respect to Italians and Germans. And of course, when we speak of evacuation, we no longer just speak of aliens. This would encompass citizens as well, first and second generation, as happened in the case of the Japanese. We in the Italian community became quite alarmed at these rumors, and they were only rumors at the time. And so we formed an organization known as Italians Loyal to the United States. It was an incorporated association of prominent and active citizens in the Italian community. And we made known our position. And we first went to see Earl Warren. A delegation went to see Earl Warren, who was then the Attorney General. Now, Earl Warren, as you know, had been sympathetic to the evacuation of the Japanese as Attorney General, and we went to see him, and he allayed our fears and said that as far as he was concerned, he knew of no such contemplation, and that he himself, of course, felt that it wasn't necessary, that he had a high regard for the Italians. We then asked for a meeting with General DeWitt, and we were granted an audience with him, and 5 of us went out to the Presidio. We had to be screened to get in there because it was quite an armed camp. As
Can you remember those 5 that went with you?
Unfortunately, I can't, but I can remember some of them. There was, I can remember 4. There was myself, there was Mr. Tramuttolo, an attorney who later on became U.S. Attorney. He was president of the committee known as Italians Loyal to the United States. Mr. John Fagoni and Mr. James DeMartini. I can't remember who the 5th
was Banshee there.
I can't remember. I thought you might have been the 5th, Armand, but you
I don't
weren't.
remember. I was
Anyway, we went out there, and when we got there, General DeWitt was too busy to see us, taking care of the war and the war problems. But we did speak to his aide, and he assured us that as far as he knew, there was no such movement in contemplation. We felt that since we were there, we might as well make our point, and we were very emphatic that the Italians would not go, that we would resist going, that there were just too many of us in California to have such a mass movement. We also impressed upon the DeWitt's aide. Sorry, I can't remember his name. He had a high rank. He was a general himself or a colonel, and we impressed upon him that it would be disastrous if anyone ever moved the Italians out of California, because we said, who's going to collect your garbage? Who's going to fish your fish? Who's going to raise your crops? And what are you going to do with A.P. Giannini, the president of the largest bank in the world, and things like that? And I think we made our point. I think you can say that the story falls flat after that because nothing ever did happen.
Columbus Day, 1942. Mr. DeMartini, was there ever any question as to whether Columbus Day would in fact be held in 1942? Did Italians consider the celebration at that point an embarrassment?
Well, the celebration was originally it was under the Italian Catholic Union, which abandoned and turned it over after many years, as I said last time, on the movement of anti-clericalism, but they felt that had subsided, and so the Italian societies took over the direction of the celebration. And they were extremely fearful, and in view of the conditions, the unsettled conditions, they felt that they would not have it. And I was informed of that, and so I contacted Justice Molinari and some other members of our group, and we got together with the Italian Catholic Federation, which had been holding parades and had the know-how. And in 19 days, the celebration was put together, and for the first 2 years, it was put in joint with this community group and the Italian Catholic Federation. And then later, it was turned, or a committee was formed, and articles of incorporation drafted by Justice Molinari were put into effect, and the celebration has been going on all these years, since 1942, wasn't it, Justice? Mm-hmm. And very successful in gathering momentum, but the Italian societies were about to abandon it, and fortunately, we were able to put it on and carry it on until it is a great event that it is now. And the Justice deserves a lot of credit. He's been on the chairman of the board ever since the year he left as president.
Well, alluding to 1942, Armand, you will recall that we were also apprehensive as to whether we should have a Columbus Day celebration in view of the fact that it had an Italian atmosphere. But interestingly enough, a few months before the celebration was to be held, President Roosevelt came on the radio and extolled the Italians and said that they should go ahead throughout the United States and have their Columbus Day celebrations. And we did. But of course, we were hampered a little bit. You know, we used to have our landing of Columbus, as we still do today, down at Aquatic Park. But the Aquatic Park building and the entire Aquatic Park area had been taken over by the military. Actually, there was barbed wire all along the beach there in front of the Maritime Museum, and so we couldn't have our landing of Columbus down at Aquatic Park Lagoon. And so, of course, we improvised. We put a replica of the Santa Maria on a flat-body truck, and Columbus landed in Washington Square Park here in the center of North Beach.
Well, that's perhaps what started the great floats with the Santa Maria on it. I wanted to go back to something that, listening to the dialogue that has fascinated me, it was brought out with reference at least to the Japanese. It was somewhat like a carpetbagger movement to take over their property. And needless to say, because of the contributions of the Italians from the 1880s and the amount of developments in land, agricultural land, a takeover could have been quite a thing. Was there any notations ever given of that it really, kind of a land takeover, as some people put it, because a real battle took place to get back the land for the Japanese?
Yes, and many of them never got it back. I don't know that, even in the case of the Japanese, that it was a planned takeover. It just happened. A lot of the Japanese sold their properties at distressed prices. A lot of them preferred to get whatever money they could, and those, I think, were the ones who were most affected because they sold their property at distressed prices. And of course, that could have happened to a lot of Italians too if an evacuation had taken place. Those who didn't give up their property, of course, eventually recovered it, but it took a lot of building up. Some of it had been allowed to deteriorate and so forth. So there was that problem.
Did the German community have a similar committee as the Italians, or do they face any of this?
I was never aware that the German people were excited about this. I think you can truly say about the Germans that they had really perhaps integrated more than the Italians. The German movement and German organizations were very strong in San Francisco at the turn of the century and in the tens, but they ceased having, in my observation, as many activities as the Italians. At least, Armand, do you agree with me there?
I think, yeah, because I
Their
don't have
activity
any.
was subdued, and perhaps
Yeah.
they felt that perhaps Hitler had more to be blamed for than Mussolini, and so they were the German people, as far as I could tell, were really soft pedaling and were really quiet in the entire wartime. But I suppose some of their leaders were just sitting back to see what would happen to the Italians. But I think if the evacuation would have taken place, it certainly would have included the Germans as well as the Italians. And at the same time, I don't think that General DeWitt would have moved the Italians and not the Germans. But we might have overreacted to it. But there's an old saying that the best defense is a good offense. So those of us who had formed this committee were distressed at what had happened to the Japanese, and we didn't want it to happen to the people of Italian descent, and so we at least were prepared.
During that period, a little research that I've done on the subject, there was a new technique in the area of warfare propaganda. Sink a ship, slip of a lip, sinks a ship, and innuendos. Were there many directed towards the Italians at that given time? Can you recall?
No.
Yeah, I can't recall anything like that. No, actually, as the initial impact of the war had subsided, there really wasn't any anti-Italian activity in the United States. Everyone seemed to recognize that the people who were in this country of Italian descent really had nothing to do with the
Well, of course,
war.
still must have had some memories of their gallantry during World War I when they were principal ally of this
That's
country
right.
and of
That's
France and of England.
And yet, Judge Molinari, before the outbreak of the war, wasn't there a perceptible pro-fascist movement among Italians in San Francisco? Were there pro-fascist organizations?
I suppose there were some. They were never actively represented as such, but you have to realize that a lot of Italians were proud of Mussolini's accomplishments in what he had done for Italy internally. A lot of them were recent immigrants, and they knew what their country was like when they left it, and they had a certain amount of pride that here was a man who, as far as the internal affairs of Italy, had done very much for Italy, and they were proud about. The only mistake that Mussolini made was that he went on the wrong side of the war. He would probably, if he had become an ally, he would probably be a very famous man in the eyes of Americans today. So I think you have to look at it that way. What people call pro-fascist activity was really, I think, an admiration for some internal accomplishments that had occurred in Italy that Italians were proud of, such as restoring the swamps to productive agricultural land, even running the trains on time, which is something you hear about all the time. But Italy, Mussolini had a number of pluses, and I think when you speak of pro-fascist activity, it was just pride in that Mussolini, up to a certain point in time, had made Italy a very important factor in the family of nations, and it was just pride of anything that's Italian, whether it's Columbus and the discovery of America, or Dante, or any of the great Italians.
Yeah, there was another thing, you see, during that time they had two famous committees, the Dies Committee in the federal government and the Tenney Committee in Sacramento, and they called many of these Italians who were active in Italian clubs, such as Mr. Andriano and others, to testify. They even called the mayor of San Francisco, Angelo Rossi. And those of us who know Rossi, he was born up in Amador County, and the man was an American to the core. He couldn't even speak a word of Italian. But anyone that had any connection with an Italian society. But in looking over that book and that testimony, I don't believe that they uncovered one bit of evidence that there was any fascist group operating in San Francisco.
Well, also going from 1930 to 1934, across the country, Roosevelt, for example, praised the efforts of Benito Mussolini. In fact, at one period of time, front pages claimed him as one of the great leaders of the world, a humanitarian, etc. In fact, one of the missions was that the great inventor, Guglielmo Marconi, was sent on a special trip. In fact, I think in 1934 he came to San Francisco, which gave another boost of pride. Perhaps you can relate about that experience of the arrival of that great inventor.
Well, we'll let Armand do that because he was there at...
Well, what I remember is that Mussolini and his lady were at the Italian Church of Saints Peter and
You mean
Paul.
Marconi?
Marconi, what would I say?
And Mussolini?
No, not Mussolini. Marconi was there with his lady, and they gave they had a beautiful celebration of Mass and everything, and a beautiful dinner, and all the people there, and there was a great deal of enthusiasm. People gathered around on the outside of it, in front of the square, and this great Italian inventor, and it was quite a celebration.
Wasn't this the same time that they dedicated this bench that's up on Telegraph Hill to
I think,
Marconi?
yeah, I think that was at the same
I should
time.
correct the date. I said 34, but it was 32 if my memory
Yes,
serves
yes.
me right.
Turning for just a second here, and we have just about a second, to Italian pro-America activities. You mentioned, Judge, a committee or an organization called Italians Loyal to the United States. I suppose it was incorporated under California law. Did it maintain its incorporation for very long? Was it able to?
Well, of course, like a lot of these organizations, when it had served its purpose, no one did much more about it, and it sort of went, it became dormant. The interesting thing about it is that this organization was later suspended as a corporation because no one they had no offices any longer, active offices, and we had a law passed in California that all nonprofit corporations, that the officers had to take a loyalty oath, and there was no one around to take a loyalty oath, and so this organization, known as Italians Loyal to the United States, was ultimately suspended as a corporation because there was no one to take a loyalty oath to the United States and the state of California.
Well, gentlemen, we've run out of time, and once again we wish to thank Armand DeMartini and Justice John Molinari for joining us today on this, the second program of the series Italians in California,